Randomizers are a classic when it comes to Nuzlocking, and I used to do runs just about every day in high school, to my teacher's great pleasure, I assume. The surprise of what encounter you're going to get is the best part of a Nuzlocke, and a randomizer ramps that up to 11 since you could get anything. So how exactly is this going to work? Well, as always, we get one capture per area, whatever the first randomized thing I find is. Any Pokemon that faints is boxed forever. No items from the bag are allowed in battle, and I always play on set mode. Also, I can't level past the next boss fight's highest level Pokemon before entering the fight or trial. So join me as I attempt to beat the hardest Pokemon game using only randos. Ah yes, Melemele Island. Seems tranquil, but you randomly get attacked by Yungoos. However, luckily our randomized starters are here to save us, and our choices are Lillipup, Timber, and Trico. You're a very weird looking Trico. To get us started, I name it Upstart Goblin, and since every single ability is randomized in the game, yeah, we've got Strong Jaw, which doesn't help in the slightest. This of course means that How's gonna have a Timber for the rest of the journey, but the rest of the trainer Pokemon are unrandomized. Also, How, why would you apologize to Litten? That's pretty random. The trainers in this game are really tough, and randomizing them all would make things a lot easier, and I'll explain why later, but to balance that, the totem Pokemon will all be totally random for some really chaotic madness. But this leads us to our first random encounter of the game, and our Route 1 encounter is a Corphish that actually happens to have Download as its ability. I name it Crab Turtle, and that attack-lowering nature is not doing us any favors. At the trainer school, I find myself a randomized zoom lens, after which we have to take on our first difficult trainer fight versus Teacher Emily. Since we picked the Poplio slot, she's got a Rowlet, which means she's got super effective typings against both of our team members. Download unfortunately raised our special attack instead of attack, so Vice Grip is pretty much not doing any damage at all as we survive on 1 HP, which means it's time to swap out into Trico. Since I don't expect to do any damage at all, I go for a Leer, but Quick Attack is still in a range where I can't take this thing out without going down, but an Oran Berry is enough to keep us healthy so that we can take out the Rowlet. That could easily have been the end of the run right there. Alola is famous for its early difficult fights. Once in Holy City, we get our next randomized encounter, which happens to be an Eevee. I name it Karibo, and Rattled isn't exactly the craziest of abilities, but at least it's not bad. And those are the only 3 encounters we can get before taking on Alima, a famous run killer. And even though the trainers have the same Pokemon, they can have crazy abilities like Mega Raygoose here. And I know that Eevee's not going to be able to do too much this fight, so I use 2 Growls to weaken this thing's attack before it's time to swap out into Crab Turtle. And luckily Yungoos has lower defense than special defense, so we get the attack boost off of Download. But even with that boost, we really don't do that much damage with Vice Grip. However, since the Yungoos is trying to mitigate the attack we lowered with Eevee, we easily have enough time to use 3 Vice Grips to take it out. But then comes the real threat, Smeargle, and since we picked the Poplio slot, it's gonna go for Leaf Edge here so we can safely switch in Trico. But since Trico's attack stat is pretty poor, I once again go for a Leer, and my quick attacks are doing barely any damage at all, so I decide to swap out again into Crab Turtle. I once again get the attack boost, engaging by this damage from a stab tackle. It shouldn't do that much with Leaf Edge, and it leaves us on 2 HP after a crit, and a Vice Grip takes it out.
If you won't stop trying to leave the bag, Nebby, I won't stop hitting it.
Our Route 2 encounter is a Sandy Burmy that I name Morphing Jar. And at the Howley Cemetery, I find myself a Deerling with the Poison Point ability. I name it Gaia, the Fierce Knight, and move on to the first trial. Now, as you know, the first trial in Ultra Sun is versus a Gumshoes, but since we've randomized them, it's gonna be versus something completely different. And our debut opponent is going to be Totem Quilava, which isn't exactly perfect since I decided to lead with Gaia. Figuring that I can probably survive an Ember, I go for a Sand attack to lower accuracy here, and Ember does about 60% as it then calls in a Cherubi. I figure my best bet is to swap into Crab Turtle, who gets a special attack boost and tanks a few hits before I dodge a Leer and can go for a Bubble, taking out half the health of Quilava. I do end up getting Leech Seeded, but the next turn I dodge a Smokescreen because of that Sand attack, and another Bubble takes it out. This only leaves Cherubi, but since the TMs are also randomized like the items, I got X-Scissor instead of Brick Break inside the trial, so it goes pretty smoothly. Now that we've claimed the first Z Crystal, I can find an encounter in Verdant Cave, and I find myself a Surskit that has Parental Bond. I was surprised that this ability actually works, and I named it Watapon. Then on Route 3, my encounter's a Rowlet with a Sandveil ability that I named Little Wingguard. I also find Skull Servant the Duskull, which trivializes the fight versus Dulce since his Furfo can't even hit ghost types. My final encounter before Hala is is a Binacle that I named Manju of the 10,000 Hands, and I also managed to evolve Trico into a Grovyle. And with that, we actually pretty much have the perfect team to beat Hala, since both his Machop and Makuhita can't hit ghost types whatsoever, barring Sand Attack. And Machop can't even do that, so after using Focus Energy, I use a free Nightshade, and he decides to swap out into Crabrawler, who's got Pursuit, which means that I'm not going to be too keen on swapping out here, so I stay in and tank it and go for a Zoom Lens boosted Disable. And being confident that the Disable isn't going to wear off immediately, I go for a free Nightshade before I decide to swap out into Little Wingard. I end up getting leered on the switch and then hit by an all-out pummeling, which I thought was going to do massive damage, but it doesn't even do half. Which means that I'm free to peck his crusty behind out of existence. I end up taking out Makuhita with Crab Turtle after getting tired of missing my Nightshades, and since Machop can't touch me at all, it's a free kill. And with that, we've got the Grand Trial in the bag, which means I pick up the final encounter on Melemele Island in 10 Carat Hill, which happens to be a Larvitar. I was pretty ecstatic about this one, and it's got Fairy Aura, which just means that it gets hit harder by super effective fairy moves, and I of course name it after the Red Eyes Black Dragon. Finally, I evolve Little Wingard into Dartrix before facing my fears and Mantine surfing my way to Akala Island. Land ahoy, or land ashore, whatever you say. How, you are not exactly a maritime master. And things start out pretty shaky on Akala as I barely survive versus Dexio's Espeon, taking it out with an X-Scissor. We also have access to some new encounters, first off on Route 4 where I find a Herdier. I also pick up a Master Ball, excuse me, what? And of course Paniola Ranch where I find myself a Barboach with the ability Neuroforce. Yeah, that's Ultra Necrozma's ability. At this point, we're faced with one of Ulaula's difficult early game fights again versus Gladion, who's got Type Null with really inflated stats for this point in the game. Since Zorua has a randomized ability, it's not under illusion, and we can take it out with a couple of X-Scissors. He then sends in Zubat, and with Download, it gets a free attack boost, so I have to swap out into Crab Turtle, expecting the Wing Attack, which does massive damage. I'm only going to be able to take one more, so because I got a special attack boost, I decide to go for Bubble Beam to do as much damage as possible before swapping out into Mary. And even Mary gets hit down below half health before I can manage to take it out with a Tackle. This means Gladion only has Type Null left, which ability is randomized into Psychic Surge. And unfortunately, I can't really switch anything into this thing, so Mary has to go down, doing pretty minimal damage in the process. I then decide to send in Red Eyes, since this thing doesn't have great moves to hit it with, and Pursuit doesn't do too much damage, so I hit a free Screech. I then hit this typeless miscreation with an Iron Tail, which lowers its defense as well, so my next bite takes it down into the red. After surviving a Pursuit on just 4 HP, another bite is enough to take out the Type Null, defeating Gladion, but we did get our first death on the board. In a pile of randomized berries, I pick up both a Life Orb and some leftovers. I also find my Route 5 encounter, a Weasel that I name Rescue Ferret. And so the time has come to take on the water trial versus Totem Araquanid, or in this case, Totem Pangoro. And I assume this thing has Contrary, since its speed boost actually gave it negative speed. Now let me explain why randomizing every trainer would make this run a lot easier, because every randomized Pokemon only has the 4 last moves that it could learn for its level. Meaning that this would be the exact moveset for a level 20 Pangoro, which could either be incredibly deadly if those were dangerous moves, but in this case, I actually have a win condition if I can get in Duskull alone, so after taking out the Ekans, I survive on 1 HP and decide to swap out. And basically, as long as Pangoro doesn't have an ally Pokemon, there's nothing it can hit Duskull with because of its immunities, so I get off 2 Nightshades before it calls in its ally Raticate. My mistake here was not checking its moveset because it goes for a Pursuit, which does a lot of damage as I swap in Little Wingard. I then get hit by a barrage of moves as I try to hit with a Razor Leaf, but it doesn't do that much damage, and after being left on 13 HP, it's time to swap out into Upstart. But after getting hit hard with a Slash, Grovyle manages to take out Raticate with a Brick Break, after which it gets hit by a Karate Chop down to just 1 HP. However, now that Pangoro doesn't have any ally Pokemon to call on, Duskull has free reign to take it out with a Nightshade, winning us the water trial. With all these losses, we're gonna anger our bosses. What do you guys work at Goldman Sachs? With the water trial behind us, we can get ourselves one more encounter in Wella Volcano Park, a Tentacool with Fluffy as its ability. I go ahead and name it Jellyfish, which is actually a real card, and evolve Wadapon into Masquerain before it's time to take on the fire trial. And this time, the totem Pokemon is randomized into a Ninjask, which gets a speed boost, which is pretty ironic. I go ahead and start with Wadapon, who's already been damaged while going through the trial. And very unfortunately, I miss my first Air Cutter as Ninjask calls in a Fortress. The next turn, I only get hit twice by a Fury Swipes, and I can hit an Air Cutter for over half damage, but it actually has a randomized Berry Juice to get most of its health back. A takedown takes me down to 3 HP, which means I have to switch out into Jellyfish, but because of Fluffy, our defense is massive. Fluffy halves any incoming contact move, so I start going for Acid Spray here to lower the ninja's special defense. It then goes for Sand Attack, which makes me miss my next Acid Spray, but I decide to try and go for another since my health is pretty high at this point, and I manage to land it to get it to -4 special defense. After another Absorb, I miss a Water Pulse and get taken down to 5 HP, so it's time to swap out into Crab Turtle, who does get the special attack boost. However, I do end up getting hit by a barrage of attacks on Switch In, taking me down very low before I can take out the Ninjask with a Bubble Beam because of all those negative boosts. The Fortress once again takes me down to 5 HP, but at this point it doesn't really have any moves that do a lot of damage to Duskull, so I can freely switch in and take it out with a Nightshade, claiming our 3rd trial. Wait a minute, if you guys are trading Pokemon through a DS, does that mean that the Pokemon games exist in the Pokemon world, or that you can trade real Pokemon through a DS? I'm confused. This leads us to the 4th trial versus Lurantis, but since the randomizing can be pretty hit or miss, this one's super easy versus Oranguru and Roselia, which are handled easily by Wadapon. Looker is my name. Okay, somebody's feeling himself today. My encounter at Memorial Hill is a Pansear with Liquid Voice, which always reminds me of Liquid Ass. And there was a guy at my middle school who actually got expelled for using it in our classroom, couldn't go to school for a week. In preparation for the Olivia fight, I evolved Weasel into Floatzel. And so the time has come to take on the 2nd grand trial versus the best girl, Olivia. And she has some Pokemon that can hit really hard, so this fight is not one you can take lightly. Now I thought I would take this Smackdown a lot better, but since it's not a contact move, it does massive damage, and I set up a barrier, which means I'm only going to be able to tank 1 more before setting up 1 layer of Toxic Spikes. I then swap out into Floatzel, who can actually take a Smackdown a little bit better and retaliate with an Aqua Jet that does way over half, so the next turn we can take it out with another one, being left on only 16 HP. Laleep is next, and not wanting to be drained, I go ahead and swap out into Upstart, but she actually ends up going for a full heal to cure the poison, so I go for an X-Scissor, which does about 1/3, but luckily Ancient Power doesn't do that much, so we can take it out in a few hits. However, the real challenge has only just begun, as her Lycanroc is super strong, and not wanting to get hit by this Continental Crush, I swap out into Red Eyes, who actually takes a massive hit from this. I then swap out into Corphish, which is where I make a pretty dumb play. Gauging by the damage that I take from Bite, I figure I can take another one, but of course it's just gonna go for Rock Tomb, so I lose a Pokemon pretty stupidly. Then Little Wingard flinches, who could easily take this thing out with a Razor Leaf, which means it goes down as well, so things are not looking good, but luckily an Aqua Jet is enough to take it out, claiming the trial. And unfortunately, Herdier, you're about to get a lot of company very soon. I'm not just a tunnel enthusiast, but a resort enthusiast as well. Tunnel enthusiast is at least one of the most creative innuendos I've ever heard, I'll give you that. But before we leave Akala Island, we have one more encounter to get on the beach, and it's a horsey. It's got the Levitate ability, which is definitely going to come in handy, and I of course name it after the Kaiser Seahorse. Our journey then takes us to Ulaula Island, where I start to make some big changes to the team. Evolving Red Eyes into Pupitar, Jellyfish into Tentacruel, and Crazy Fish into Whiscash.
When your Pokemon evolve, do you think they feel like, yes, finally?
Well, definitely not my next encounter Dino, because it's never gonna get to evolve. However, north of Maui, I find myself a Houndour that I name Mad Dog of Darkness and immediately evolve into a Houndoom. And I was pretty surprised that I could find an Ashhat Pikachu, especially one that has Magic Guard. Because the randomizer changes the Pokemon into something of similar strength, it turned into an Illumise, so the electric trial was super simple and we claim our victory. And before we face Guzma, I decide to go to Route 11 to pick up my next encounter, an Esper, and immediately evolve it into Meowstic. Which leads us to what's going to be a very unforgiving part of the game. You see, without emergency exit, Golisopod is so much stronger, but I do manage to take it out with Wadapon, and the real threat is his own Masquerain, which does actually end up taking me out because there's nothing I can switch into a Parental Bond boosted hit. Even Pupitar, with pretty good defenses, survives on only 3 HP, after which I can take it out with a Rock Slide, but that thing was a real threat. Making our way towards the Ghost Trial, I managed to find a Tauros, and at Blush Mountain I find a Surge Surfing Parasect. Which brings us to trial number 6 versus Totem Mimikyu that's randomized into a Swanna. It does end up getting every single stat boosted, but luckily I ended up leading with Rescue Cat that has Charge Beam. I don't expect Charge Beam to be a one-hit knockout after those boosts, but I don't even end up getting the special attack boost, and it calls in for its ally Shift Ray. Now this was of course completely random, but I thought it was super cool since Swanna goes for Rain Dance here, and Shift Ray by default actually has Hurricane, which means it hits every single time. I do end up taking out the Swanna with a critical hit for my second Charge Beam, but as you can see, the Shift Ray goes for Hurricane, and I can freely just take it out with Sludge Bomb. Not very difficult, but very cool how it randomized. And now that the level cap's increased, we can evolve Duskull into Dusclops, Horsey into Seadra, Grovyle into Sceptile, Burmy into Wormadam, and Deerling into Sawsbuck. Can also get our next encounter in the red fields of Ulaula that happens to be a Fletchling that does have the download ability, which is absolutely insane. I immediately evolve it into a Talonflame, and on Route 17, I find my next encounter an Onyx. Yeah, so that's not happening. Once we go to Po-Town, we do have to have our second fight with Guzma, and much like in the first fight, since Masquerain is so strong and fast, I do end up having to sacrifice Tauros in order to be able to take it out with Uriah. Which leads us to the final fight on Ulaula versus Nanu and his Dark types. Naturally, he leads with Sableye, so I go into Jellyfish, going to Protect to dodge that fake out. I then use a couple of Dazzling Gleams to take it out no problem as he sends in his Krokorok. Expecting him to go for Earthquake, I can swap into Sceptile, who tanks it very well. And since I outspeed, I can just go for a Leaf Blade, taking it out, which only leaves the biggest threat, Persian. I do expect Nanu to go for the Dark Z move here, but he actually just goes for Dark Pulse, which makes things really complicated since I now have to swap out into Dusclops to tank a Power Gem. Now expecting him to go for the Dark Z move, I swap back into Mad Dog of Darkness, and he actually does, and I tank it on barely any HP left. Since he's used his big blowout move, I'm pretty free to switch into Jellyfish here, hoping that I don't get flinched by a Dark Pulse and I can use a Scald in the last turn of the rain. And after a bit of protecting and leftovering, I can take another one, I don't get flinched, and finally manage to take it out to beat the Grand Trial of Ulaula. It's Aether Foundation time, and it's about to get really bad, boys. And the first real difficult fight on this man-made island is the third fight versus Guzma, and this guy's already taken 2 of our Mons. I decide this time to lead with Parasect and go for Protect so that he can't hit me with a first impression, and then go for my Spore so that Sucker Punch won't hit me. Since the Golisopod is most likely to at least stay asleep for a couple of turns, I decide to use 2 Giga Drains before starting to spam Spore once again, since if at any time it wakes up while I'm using Giga Drain, it's not going to be very good for Parasect. The next time it wakes up, Guzma has wised up and he does go for a Razor Shell for a bit of damage before I put it to sleep and take it out with a final Giga Drain. This leads us to his big problem Pokemon Masquerain, and I don't really have an answer to switch into this thing, so I have to let Maneater Bug go and swap into Talonflame. And since I got an attack boost from download, I can use a powerful Stab super effective Acrobatics to take it out in one shot as he then sends in Pinsir. Expecting him to go for a Stone Edge, I swap into Jellyfish, who doesn't tank it very well, but I use Protect in order to stall out as many of his Stone Edges as possible. After burning 3 of his PP, I don't manage to get the burn with Scald, but I can Protect to get rid of the 4th Stone Edge, but then I have to switch out into Rescue Ferret. After Floatzel takes the final Stone Edge, I can freely swap back into Uriah. Since Pinsir can't hit me for super effective damage anymore, I don't take too much from an X-Scissor, and 2 Acrobatics is enough to take it out. Since he's obviously going to go for a Thunderbolt here to take out Uriah, I swap into Mad Dog of Darkness, who just barely holds on with 9 HP, and unfortunately doesn't do too much with a Fire Fang, which means it's bye-bye time. And here, I have no idea why I thought Rescue Ferret was going to be able to take this thing out with an Aqua Tail, because it's pretty tanky, so I kind of sacrificed this thing for no reason. Fortunately though, it did leave him at little enough HP that I can just come in and take him out with an Acrobatics, but this means that Guzma took out 5 of my Mons total. And the worst of it all is that we have an even more difficult fight coming up versus Lusamine, the biggest Karen of all time. Now I know she's got Psychic on her Clefable, but figuring that Jelly can take 1, I go for a Sludge Bomb, and I actually manage to get the poison, and for whatever reason I can't explain, she goes for Charm, which means I'm at full HP and can take out the Clefable for free. I then try and fish for a burn against Beware, but I don't end up getting it, and Takedown does so much damage that I have to swap out into Skull Servant. Now the reason I expect she swaps out here is because she probably got normalized as a random ability, which means she can't hit Dusclops whatsoever. I knew this as soon as she couldn't hit me with a Dual Chop, so I go for a Curse to try and hit the Milotic, but it ends up hitting Lopunny instead. I go into Jellyfish to try and stall out a few turns, and as the last turn is about to take it out, I swap out into Upstart Goblin to tank a Thunder Punch. It does get a crit, but still doesn't do too much damage, and Curse ends up taking it out, which means that Milotic is about to be swapped in. I manage to outspeed it and go for a Leaf Blade, taking it down below half health as it hits me with an Icy Wind, which lowers my speed. This means that I'm not going to be able to outspeed it again and take it out with a Leaf Blade, so I elect to swap into Rescue Cat, who unfortunately is going to have to be sacked off here so that I can swap in, outspeed, and take out the Milotic. She once again swaps in Beware, and knowing that it can't do anything to Dusclops, I switch it in, and knowing that she's gonna swap again, I should have probably hard switched, but I end up going for a Will-O-Wisp, which doesn't matter since this thing's a special attacker. I go ahead and swap in Uriah, and unfortunately I get a special attack boost instead of attack as I get hit by 2 Petal Dances, which don't do too much at all since I quad resist it, and a Flying Gem boosted Acrobatics takes it out. This of course only leaves Beware, so I can swap into Dusclops to guarantee my win, but I don't have any moves that can hit it either, so I just have to wait for Burn to take it out. Leroy Jenkins. Lily then decides to turn into a British schoolgirl before we head off to our final destination on Poni Island. This of course means that we can get a few new encounters, first of which is a Pyroar. Then, on the Ancient Pony Path, I find myself a Grubbin. And finally, once on Executor Island, I get one more random encounter, which happens to be a Combuskin that I immediately evolve into Flame Swordsman the Blaziken. When Necrozma comes, then will you battle it? No dog, haven't you heard? It's gonna be randomized. I do of course end up getting an encounter in Vast Pony Canyon, which is a Mawile. However, when whittling it down to catch it, I find out that it has Wimp Out, which means I don't get it. I'm also incredibly surprised when I fight this trainer with my Neuroforce Whiscash that it's got Innards Out, which means it's lights out for Crazy Fish. This of course means I need to update the team by evolving Binacle, Eevee, and Grubbin. The Dragonclaw TM is also randomized into Toxic, which is going to come in mighty handy. Next up is Totem Komodo, and since it randomizes into similar strength, it ends up being a Totem Dragonite. Since I had no idea what it was going to be, but probably a pseudo-legendary, I decided to lead with Jellyfish, and a Dragon Rush doesn't do too much damage before I can Toxic it. It then calls in its ally Pokemon, which ends up being a Xurkitree. I go for a Protect the next turn to stall a bit more poison damage, but also to scout exactly what moves they're going to use next turn so I can freely swap in Morphing Jar. I do end up taking a ton of damage from Dragon Rush, but Thunderbolt doesn't affect us, so the next turn I can go for another Protect before swapping out into Manju. Aqua Tail hits hard, and I know that it's not going to go for Thunderbolt, but Signal Beam actually gets me down super low and gets the Confusion, so I'm not comfortable going for the Protect the next turn to take out the Dragonite, so I end up having to switch in Vikavolt as the Dragonite just goes for Agility its final turn, and I get hit by a Thunderbolt, which does a bit more than I would expect. Finally, the Dragonite goes down, and I manage to poison the Xurkitree, so after swapping between Jellyfish and Morphing Jar a bit, it finally goes down to the poison. Personally, I wouldn't consider Toxic the most fun or honorable of strategies, but for a fight like this, where they could have probably taken me down very easily without it, I'm very glad I used it. Now that we've completed the 7th trial, Ulaula gets attacked by aliens, which works out for Olivia since she finds the buff handsome man she's always been looking for. However, for us, it means that we have to take on Ultra Necrozma, or rather, Mewtwo, which I think is a pretty fitting randomized encounter. And much like Ultra Necrozma, it gets every single one of its stats boosted, so I decide to go for an unconventional strategy, taking me down to my Focus Sash as I go for Endeavor, taking it down to 1 HP. I continue clicking Endeavor just in case Mewtwo decides to go for Recover, but this of course means that I'm gonna end up having to sacrifice Firewall as Flame Swordsman can come in and go for a Quick Attack, cleaning up. No matter how you slice it, you always have to cheese the Ultra Necrozma fight, whether it's using Zoroark strats, Toxic, or something like this. After saving the world, I realized that I missed my encounter in Lush Jungle, and I happen upon a Shroomish, which actually has the Imposter ability. Normally, this is Ditto's hidden ability that lets you transform right away, so of course I capture it and name it Mushroom Man. And it's actually going to be totally essential as we take on the next totem Pokemon, which randomized into a Cinccino. The thing about Imposter is that not only do you turn into the Pokemon you're facing right away, you actually copy all of their boosts, in this case +2 to each stat. I decide to risk the speed tie, going for a Sing, putting the Cinccino to sleep as it calls in for its ally Pokemon Brionne. The next turn, Cinccino gets a first turn Wake Up using Helping Hand to boost Brionne's attack as I go for a Tail Slap, getting a crit on the first hit, which means I almost get it down to half HP. And it seems dead set on using Helping Hand as it boosts Brionne again as I take it down into the red. Hydro Pump hits me for about 35% damage as another Helping Hand allows me to take out the Cinccino for free, and finally Sceptile can come in and clean up the Brionne.
Watch this real close. La-di-da-di-da!
After defeating the last trial, Poni Island has one final challenge for us, and that's facing Hoppo. Since she's got ground types and leads off with Golurk, I see the perfect opportunity to let Sceptile shine. A Leaf Blade takes it down below half as Hammer Arm takes me down below half, but another Leaf Blade seals the deal for Golurk. Next is this Flygon that for whatever reason only has Earth Power and Dragon Breath, so expecting it to go for Dragon Breath, I swap into Dusclops. The following Earth Power takes me down to 8 HP as I foolishly go for a Will-O-Wisp since I realize while this doing it that this thing's a special attacker. As I swap in Sawsbuck, Hapu heals up with a full heal, and after missing a first Sleep Seed, I manage to land one before I have to swap out into Jellyfish. Expecting it to hit Jelly with an Earth Power, I swap out into Kaiser, who of course has the Levitate ability, so we manage to dodge it. Dragon Breath then does way more than I would ever expect, but fortunately a Scald is enough to take it out. Then we've got Mudsdale, and I don't really want to take a hit from this thing on anything, so I decide to just sack off Kaiser here since it's probably not going to be able to evolve anyway. This lets me send in Sceptile, outspeed the Mudsdale, and of course take out the Gastrodon for the win. Now this is a hardy refrigerator that looks like it would last through the end of the world. Excessive, but definitely better than sticking my food inside of a Rotom. At this point, we need to make some final preparations. First off, evolving into Tyranitar. I then go to get my final encounter in Victory Road, which ends up being a Flygon. Since it's the last thing I'm gonna catch, I decide to use my Master Ball that I found on Route 4 and name it after the Blue Eyes White Dragon. Even though Flygon's eyes are red, and it's got Volt Absorb, which is absolutely useless on a ground type. And with the final preparations underway, it's time to take on the Pokemon League. And the first member I decided to take on is Kahili with her flying types. Since I decided to bring Jolteon to the Elite Four, it should be pretty doable, and since Braviary has Primordial Sea as its ability, I'm guaranteed to knock it out with a Thunder. Hawlucha and Oricorio are soon to follow, and Mandibuzz is kind of scary because of its massive defense, but it ends up having Emergency Exit, sending it away so I can take out Toucannon before taking out the rest of its health. That means Jolteon was definitely a great pick to bring for the Elite Four, but it's not going to be that useful versus Olivia and her rock types. Last time we faced Olivia, she really started the massacre of what's now a pretty full Fainted box. In fact, I even lead the fight the exact same way, going for Toxic Spikes with Jellyfish, this time getting hit by Rock Blast. I then immediately regret my decision to use another layer of Toxic Spikes since Rock Blast could take me out, but it only hits 3 times. Since I'm at such low health, I decide to swap in Red Eyes to tank the Rock Blast, but it actually misses, and the next turn an X-Scissor does massive damage before I can hit back with a Rock Slide. I then need to swap out once again, so I send in Karibo, hoping to tank an X-Scissor okay, but it leaves me at only 5 HP, at which point I can retaliate with a Thunderbolt, taking it out. Probopass is next, and expecting an Earth Power from this thing to take out Jolteon, I swap in Uriah, who can dodge it completely, after which I U-turn out into Flygon. I use the U-turn instead of switching in case it still has Sturdy as its ability, which probably isn't likely, but the next turn, since this thing has more special defense than defense, I can take it out with a super effective Earthquake. Olivia then sends in Cradilly, so I decide it's a good time to start setting up a few Dragon Dances before taking it out with Earthquake. This of course only leaves Lycanroc and Gigalith, and since they both have crippling weaknesses to Earthquake, I take them out in one hit. Not exactly the most difficult, but at least Olivia changed her attitude since we beat her last time, since she found love with Buzzwole. Our next opponent and third up is Acerola and her ghost types. As always, she leads off with Banette, so I decide to send in Red Eyes. She hits me with a really weak Shadow Claw, after which I get a clean one-hit knockout with Crunch. Her next Pokemon is Delmise, but before it gets to go for Energy Ball, I can hit it with Crunch to below half health, which means that since I outspeed it the next turn, it's a free knockout. This, however, will send out her Palossand, so I have to swap out here if I want to keep Red Eyes, and I go into Jellyfish. She hits a Giga Drain on the switch, and I then go for Scald, which does more than half health, and I expect to be able to tank an Earth Power here, but she actually just goes for Iron Defense, which means I get a free KO. Next up is Frostlass, which does actually outspeed Jellyfish and confuses it with a Confuse Ray, but I do manage to break through and hit it with a Scald, but I don't decide to risk it a second time, and I swap in Uriah. On the switch in, I do get the special attack boost from Download, and I manage to survive a Shadow Ball and the Blizzard Miss here to take it out with an Overheat. Perhaps a little bit overkill, but you know what they say, rather safe than sorry. Last up is Drifblim, but because it only has Ominous Wind, I managed to take it out with Poison after a really long time. This leaves us with the final Elite Four member, Molayne and his Steel types. And this is actually the main reason I wanted to bring Jolteon, because it has the Magic Bounce ability, so if this thing goes for anything but Flash Cannon, it's gonna get bounced back. However, I end up doing more than half and fully paralyzing the Klefki, so I can just take it out with a Thunder the following turn. Once Dugtrio is sent in, I know that he's gonna go for Earthquake, so it's a free switch to Uriah for me. I end up getting the attack boost from Download, which doesn't end up making a difference whatsoever since I get hit by Sucker Punch, and Overheat is still enough to take out the trio. Having both a flying and ground type is fantastic here, since Magnezone is guaranteed to go for Thunderbolt. I can freely get in Blue Eyes without taking any damage, and then take it out with a single Earthquake. Next up is Molayne's big scary Metagross, and I do about exactly half damage with Earthquake. In fact, it definitely looks like it could be a roll, or a low one would make me not take out the Metagross here, but fortunately I do get it and take it out. I then don't want to risk not taking it out with an Earthquake here, here, so I swap in Jellyfish since this thing only has contact moves. I go for a Scald, which does pretty much exactly half, getting the burn, but for whatever reason, this thing goes for Metal Sound, even though it doesn't have any special moves to use it with. Either way, we managed to get through the Elite Four without losing a single Pokemon, which means it's time to take on the final challenge versus the Great How. Okay, I can't believe I said that. However, regardless how you feel about this guy's personality, he's got a pretty tough team. Even just starting off, this Raichu can tear through your team if you don't have a good strategy, but luckily, I just slapped a Choice Scarf on Blue Eyes, taking it out in one hit with Earthquake. Hal then sends in Crabrawler, so I decide to swap into Jellyfish to eat the Ice Hammer. It barely touches me, and I go for a Scald, which actually gets the burn. This matters a whole lot, not because it's going to do less damage to me because it wasn't going to touch me anyway, but because I can get a KO with the next Scald. Since Tauros is next, I decide to swap into Uriah since it's probably going to go for an Earthquake. The Tauros then hits me with a Double Edge, getting me down to just 27 HP, after which I can go for a boosted Overheat to take it out. Next, we've got Hal's starter Conkeldurr, so I decide to swap out into Blue Eyes to eat a Stone Edge. I end up going for Earthquake here just to get a little damage, but the truth is, I'm actually just going to sacrifice Blue Eyes here, and I do fortunately get a defense drop with Superpower as well. This means that I can send Uriah back in, and this time I actually get an attack boost, which means that Acrobatics is going to be able to take out the Conkeldurr no problem. Now, unfortunately, this Noivern has a trapping ability, so I can't swap out Uriah in order to keep it around for Leafeon, so I go ahead and sack it so that I can send in Jellyfish for free and take out Noivern with an Ice Beam. This means that Hal's final Pokemon is Leafeon, and I was just going to leave Jellyfish in here to go down, but it actually survives on 11 HP, and Sludge Wave is enough to take it out. And that's how I did it. That's how I beat a Pokemon Ultra Sun Hardcore Nuzlocke using only randomized Pokemon. I thought this was incredibly fun. Just not knowing what your encounters is going to be is such a fun thing. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments and if we should do more of these because I thought it was great.